Okay, let's get started maybe. We're 20 people now. It's 6:05 on Wednesday evening. And this is the lecture in European values. Good evening, everyone. My name is Heleen Touquet. I am the holder of the chair in European values at the University of Antwerp. And the role of the chair in European values is to promote the debate about European values in its diversity. This is a chair that is sponsored by the fund Bayer-Latour and the late Baron Maurice Velge. For the purpose of debating European values, thinking about European values and what they are and what they could mean to us, we are running this series of lectures on the topic of European values and belonging together with UXIA. And this semester, our main topic is minorities by belonging and European values. We've had in October, Lilian Surdi, who talked about solidarity as a European value and refugees and asylum law. And after this lecture by Akwugo Emejulu, we will have Nuno Ferreira in December, who will talk about his project about the tensions between the European gay-friendly self-image and the contrast with the lived experiences of LGBTI refugees across Europe. We also have a book series that is ongoing, in which the lecture givers that we have invited reflect on European values. And the first book in that series is this one. This recently came out, and it features interviews with François Forêt, Cynthia Miller-Idris, and Peter Verovšek on issues such as memory politics, but also the pandemic, of course, featured very heavily in our conversation. So I can really recommend it to you. You can find it in most bookstores, and you can also order it online from the publisher called ASP Publishers. Today, it's my honor to introduce to you Professor Akwugo Emejulu from the University of Warwick. Akwugo is a political sociologist, and she works on the one hand, racial, ethnic, and gender inequalities in Europe and the United States, and on women of color's grassroots organizing and activism. And she belongs to that rare breed of great academics who also have actual direct experience working in grassroots social movements, because she worked as a community organizer. And this, of course, this experience informs her work and thinking and makes her work really fascinating, I find. Her most recent publications are To Resist is to Exist, Black Feminism in Europe, and Minority Women and Austerity, Survival and Resistance in France and Britain. She's also worked on grassroots organizing by Black feminists in Belgium, for example. So there's also a connection with our country. Her new book is to be published in 2021 and will be called Fugitive Feminism. Yeah, fascinating title. I first heard Akwugo speak in 2019 when she was talking about her project called Women of Color Resist, a 6-nation comparative research project that examines how women of color activists mobilize in the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, and Spain. Women of color often operate in hostile contexts, and her work was really about the innovative ways they use to advance their political interests. And this lecture was really quite an experience. There was such a positive energy in the room, even though Akwugo hardly did any mollycoddling of the audience. She was speaking serious truth to power. And I vowed on the spot that if I ever was in the position to organize a lecture series, she should be in it. So I can check this off my list from now. And she has some very important things to say, I think, about intersectionality, inequality, and the challenge of European values. And Akwugo was the first lecture giver who put European values between brackets, which is something we'll definitely discuss when I interview her.
Oh my goodness. Sorry. Just like, I'm horrified, but please.
Okay, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah.
So Akwugo will speak for about half an hour, and then Heleen Debeuckelaere will give a response. Heleen is a historian and a writer. She works on colonial history in Brussels, on Afrophobia and discrimination, and she writes for Bras. She also has a column in Recto Verso. And together with Hélène Cristel Munganiende, she's written about Black neighborhoods in Europe, for example, a project that was sponsored by the Fonds Pascal de Croos. She's also the initiator of the network of Métis in Belgium and the video channel Black Speaks Back. And her very new book, recently published and which she worked on during the lockdown, is called Being Imposed Upon. She worked on this book together with Gia Brassard, and it's a collection of essays in both Dutch and French, all written by women with sub-Saharan African roots. She has assured me that this book has been especially designed to fit every possible handbag you might have, and it's conceptualized as a kind of survival guide. So it's a must buy. So please go out and buy it. You can buy it in most bookstores, or you can order it from the publisher, and I will put the post the link in the chat function, so you can check that out, because we want lots of people to buy it, because it needs to be translated into English. Okay, Akwugo, I give you the floor, the proverbial floor.
Proverbial floor. Well, okay, hello everyone. Right, I'm gonna share my screen, and then fingers crossed this all goes well, because you know how it is. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this and all is well. Yeah, you guys should be able to see this. Okay, so I only have 30 minutes, so this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But first, before I get started, I first want to just say thank you to Heleen and also to Barbara for all their help, first in inviting me to speak, but then also in terms of organizing the event. We were in the middle of organizing my travel, and then the pandemic hit, and poor Barbara kept emailing me going, "Do you think you can travel now?" I was like, "No, I can't, but can you make this date?" No. And so she was they were both incredibly patient in trying to kind of fix a date for this talk. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for the invitation and being so flexible in terms of trying to organize this discussion. So for this talk, I want to discuss with you guys a wee bit of some of the emerging findings from my project, Women of Color Resist, and really to talk to you guys about this really intriguing emerging finding around issues to do with exhaustion and the work that exhaustion seems to do amongst different kinds of women of color activists across these 6 countries. So I'm very excited. And I will say that I think probably I go back and forth in terms of the kinds of talks I give, and I think this talk is going to be a bit of a downer, so slightly pessimistic, but the good thing is you have lots of nice art to look at. So you'll have so you'll be horrified, but then there's nice art. So it's kind of like a swings and roundabouts kind of thing. All right, so what I'm going to do is, hold on just a second, there we go. So I'm going to start by giving you a bit of background to the project. I'm going to talk to you a wee bit about the context that gave rise to this project in terms of kind of a 3-part catastrophe that Leah and I were particularly interested in exploring. I'm also going to talk about our methods, so you get a bit of background of who we spoke to and why and where. And then what I want to do is maybe have undertake, maybe if it's too fancy to talk about theorizing exhaustion, but I do think it's worth pausing before I show you some of the findings about trying to unpack what we mean when we're talking about exhaustion. So what are we talking about when we talk about exhaustion? And of course, I very much appreciate the allusion to Raymond Carver. So if you guys haven't read his wonderful short story collection, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, it's brilliant and wonderful, and it's been borrowed for this seminar series, and I borrowed it for my talk. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you findings. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because I think it'll be interesting for you guys to see the findings from all 6 research sites and see how, whilst what the activists are telling us is certainly not identical, there are some deep and important similarities and connections between what these different activists who come from different backgrounds working in very different contexts across Europe, what they're trying to tell us when they're talking about issues of exhaustion, and it's linked to, and the way that it troubles our ideas about solidarity, particularly in a European context. And I will continue to use these quotes, the scare quotes, because who knew people were just taking European values at face value. So I guess this is maybe a bit of a response, but also kind of poking the bear, as it were, in terms of thinking about the context that gives rise to this project, but then also thinking about perhaps unflattering and non-heroic ideas of thinking about what European values are. And so for this project, Leah and I, my co-principal and investigator and I, were particularly interested in trying to understand how women of color organize, mobilize, and respond to a three-part crisis or catastrophe. Anyway, these dark days. The first thing is, and of course, and this is where I kind of really cut my teeth in trying to understand how women of color organize, is really to do with women of color organizing in response to the ongoing catastrophe. We're still feeling the reverberations of the 2008 economic crisis, and then the subsequent austerity measures. And of course, as you know, we're living in the middle of this pandemic. And so all of these issues in terms of the deep cuts to social wealth, to the social welfare state, alongside and oftentimes overlooked the privatization and the imposition of fees in terms of trying to access the welfare state, that lives on. And what we know, of course, the great lesson of the economic crisis and austerity is that the crisis and austerity disproportionately impact women of color. And what we see is the austerity and the crisis make women of color's already fragile economic and social lives even more precarious. And I think it's important to understand austerity is also a deeply held European value. So you guys want to believe that it's just democracy and free speech and liberalism. Nah, honey, it's also austerity and the horrors that come along with it. Another important European value is the transformation, quite literally, of the Mediterranean into a graveyard. It is the de facto policy of the European Union to turn the Mediterranean into a gravesite by a policy of turning back small boats, by criminalizing humanitarian aid at sea, and also building and constructing an archipelago of detention centers at the southern border, located in the very countries that are still reeling from the effects of the imposition of austerity measures by the Troika. So this is also an important part of the European values of this construction of us and them, of the securitization of the border, and by the very nature then accepting, perhaps with a bit of sadness, but accepting the reality and making it so that literally thousands, tens of thousands of people will die at sea. And then finally, probably the most, well, they're all important, but I think the one that's very interesting, and I'll show you this in the findings, the other important part of the unflattering but yet centrally important European value is the normalization of the far right. So when I first started doing this work, well, more like 15 years ago, I used to talk about the rise of the far right. Then I used to talk about the rise of the far right. And now I've gotten to the point of talking about the normalization of the far right. And the normalization of the far right continues apace. It's not simply that far right parties and groups have enjoyed incredible electoral successes. They've entered government, they've entered coalitions, they are part of the reality of of European political life. But I think what's most interesting about the normalization of the far right, of course, is how mainline political parties on both the left and the right have sought to co-opt far right language and policies in order to stop the defection of their voters to those parties, and also to maintain some sort of fiction of populism and a fiction of being for the working people, who are, of course, always and forever coded as white. And so what we see is, in terms of the normalization of the far right, what we see is xenophobia as a state policy. And we see this across the continent. And this has very real effects, right? One of those very real effects is what we're seeing is a spike in hate crimes. But of course, because of especially in continental Europe, the unwillingness to collect statistics via race and ethnicity, it's actually very difficult to track the spike in hate crimes because of this unwillingness to collect these statistics in this way. And so we know there's a problem. We know that people, it's structurally almost impossible to map this problem, but we know that this is happening. So these are European values too, and they are important. And you can't understand the idea of European modernity, European liberal democracy, without also understanding that these values go hand in hand. And so that's what, if nothing else you take away from this talk, you take away this. And so given this context, what Leah and I wanted to understand is how women of color activists are organizing and mobilizing in the midst of catastrophe. So very briefly, I'll talk to you guys about methods. So the field work took place in these 6 cities, London, Paris, Brussels, Madrid, Copenhagen, and Berlin from May 2019 to January 2020. So these findings are hot off the press, which will be very interesting. And, you know, lucky for us, but maybe, and who knows, maybe you guys have a bit of pandemic fatigue anyway. Our field work concluded before the pandemic hit. So that was very lucky for us. And so all of that you're going to see and all that I've discussed is all pre-pandemic, but I've checked in with a number of these activists, and what we see, what I'm going to show you is that the pandemic hasn't necessarily transformed or positively influenced their experiences, but maybe I can take some of this in questions. And so what we did, Leah and I, and we had 6 research assistants in each of these sites who spoke English and the native language, and perhaps even a second and third language in order to kind of speak with folks. So it's important that you guys understand that. So the research assistants undertook 167 one-to-one interviews and focus groups with women of color activists. What we also did is they engaged in participant observation. They observed more than 50 kind of demonstrations, strategy events, you name it, in terms of kind of trying to see on the ground in real time what activists were doing, what they were saying, and what kind of impact they were making. And what we also did is that we were tracking, it sounds weird, but look folks, this is the world we live in. We tracked and analyzed activist social media activity on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which has been very, very interesting, particularly the use of Instagram stories. And of course, for those of you guys who are on Instagram know that the stories disappear in 24 hours. And so that was a very interesting methodological challenge in a way. So that's another story. So when we're talking about women of color, it's important to know that we're talking about cis and trans women, but also non-binary femmes. So we were particularly interested in the experiences of those people who are read as, even if they might not agree with that reading of them in public space, but read as women or read as feminine, even if they refuse the gender binary. That was very important for us to try to understand these experiences. And of course, when we're talking about women of color, we're talking about those women who experience processes of racialization. And when we're talking about activists, particularly interested in those who have a public politics. So they're doing things in public space and trying to advance their agenda. And we're particularly interested in those activists working against austerity, against the far right, and for migrants' rights. So these 3 areas. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about exhaustion and why I think it's so interesting, especially in this moment, because I hope you guys will have some questions about the way that exhaustion has circulated in the public discourse. But over the last 10 years or so, since I've been kind of focused on exploring women of color's activism, what I've noticed, and this is particularly in Black feminist and Afrofeminist spaces, is how exhaustion has entered and circulated within this political lexicon. And it's been especially apparent to me in the last 5 years, because I used to organize these kind of pan-European events of bringing women of color together. And in these spaces of people from all these different linguistic backgrounds, nationalities, races, ethnicities, religions, gender identities, a way in which people seem to find each other was through a discussion of exhaustion. And I found that fascinating. And then what was also fascinating is going through and analyzing all these kind of interview and focus group transcripts and seeing the echoes and the traces of this talking about exhaustion as well from the activists we spoke with. And so I've been struck by trying to figure out what is the work that exhaustion is doing in these conversations? How did it enter the lexicon? Why is it there? What are people saying besides saying that they're tired, I'm so exhausted? And I'm just, and for this talk, what I want to kind of work with you guys to consider is it possible to perhaps theorize exhaustion? Is it possible to empirically map it so we can try to understand its shifting meaning and purposes, and also to try to understand what's going on behind this activists saying this? Because it's so interesting when you're talking to people and people go, I'm so exhausted. Like, but in our kind of pre-chat, kind of Heleen D, who's so wonderfully agreed to be my discussant, was talking about how, just casually talking about how she's exhausted. And it comes up just casually in these conversations. And I think it's really important for us to try to take seriously what's being said in this moment and what that means for European values. I continue to use these scare quotes. Okay, so at least to kind of have a tentative politics or a tentative theorizing of exhaustion means that if we want to kind of really listen to what activists are telling us and really listen to this articulation, it's important for us to really consider that exhaustion, this kind of extreme fatigue, at least partially represents some kind of effective and embodied solidarity. And this is, and I find that absolutely fascinating, because across the different contexts, so 6 different research sites, speaking to hundreds of activists, people are saying they're tired. And being tired seems to represent when you can drive yourself to the point of physical exhaustion. That seems to signal that you're doing right by the community and the groups that you care about, because you're doing this work, you're working yourself to death, and that extreme level of fatigue and tiredness is you putting your body on the line. That's you embodying, that's you kind of emotionally like broken, and all the rest of it shows that you're doing the right thing in terms of how you're showing solidarity, but also how you're showing deep care. And I think that's what's really interesting, how you're showing deep care to kind of disrespected and despised others. That's something that's really interesting. And so in some ways we can think about when activists are articulating for us this idea of exhaustion, what they're saying is this is a deep solidarity that's written on the body, and can only, in some ways, can only be experienced on the body, which I think is really, really interesting. And so, for those of you who are particularly interested in kind of theorizing solidarity, you of course know that solidarity, I think it's Terry Eagleton who talks about solidarity as a structure of feeling. And so in this way, we can think of solidarity quite literally as a structure of feeling. It's a structure of feeling that is contained within the body, that demonstrates that your activism is effective and is making an impact, which I think is really interesting. But then exhaustion also functions in this other way, which I think is important, that the weariness, so the articulation of saying you're tired, of you're sick and tired of being sick and tired of being weary, what you're doing is you're interpolating, right? You're calling forth, you're bringing something into being, you're seeking a deep connection with others. So you're being hailed. So when you hear, I'm exhausted, I'm so tired, all the rest of it, what activists what they are also doing is building and reconfirming a collective identity, which can then subsequently be mobilized to action, which I think is so fascinating, because it's one of those things when people say that they're exhausted in these conversations, no one has to say, oh, why? Like, it's one of those things if you're looking for kind of further information, that shows you're part of the out group. You're not getting what we're talking about, like the 3-part catastrophe. The fact that you even have to consider this shows us something important. So there's something going on here in terms of how exhaustion is meant to hail the other, right? And bring that person or those fellow activists into into a moment of mutual recognition and building kind of these deep connections, but also recognizing this idea of linked fate. And I wish we talked about that more, particularly in a European context, about solidarity. This is such an important concept that's borrowed from kind of African-American political behavior, but this idea of linked fate, that if you go down, I go down, all the rest of it, I think is actually very, very important. And so in this way, that exhaustion then is a teacher. Exhaustion is deeply, deeply educational, because what it does, it shows kind of the limits, but also perhaps the possibilities of solidarity work. And in the findings, I'm going to show you some examples. I think I'm probably only going to show you examples of the limits of solidarity work. I'm sorry, because I think folks need to see it. I think it's actually important to see this. And maybe in questions, you can ask me some, to show you some more positive examples. And then the other thing is, and I'm going to start my findings with this point, is to always understand that although exhaustion is a deeply emotional and individualized moment and a state of being, exhaustion is also structural. The ways in which we organize our economic, social, and political lives demands exhaustion from groups unequally. And so some people are forced into a position of exhaustion based on the context I showed you earlier. And I'm going to show you 3 examples of what this structural exhaustion looks like, because I think that's actually really important. So I'm going to move on to my findings. I only have a little bit of time left, so I want to make sure that Heleen has an opportunity to respond. But so I'm going to show you some findings. And so like I said, I'm going to show you 6 slides. People oftentimes don't like a lot of text on the slide, but I actually think it's important for you to see and read their words. But I'm going to show you kind of 6 examples of the different permutations of exhaustion and what that looks like in the 6 research sites. So it's a little whistle-stop tour, which I hope you will find interesting. So this is a response from a Black British anti-fascist activist. So she does a lot of very interesting work. She does a bit of kind of abolitionist work. She does quite a lot of work in terms of migrants' rights. And she also does a lot of feminist activism as well as kind of interestingly kind of fighting fascists in the streets, which is always very interesting. So this is what she says in terms of thinking about this idea of structural exhaustion. So remember that kind of the organization of our political, economic, and social lives in such a way that demands, that requires some groups, in this case, women of color, to be exhausted. So she says this, quote, "The far right get into the spaces of everyday life through their loudness, connection to football, so they pop up in these places and push people towards a more violent, fascistic mindset. It's the epistemic frame that we are in, that they can pull formal politics that then ricochets out into the policies and their implementation. That's always been the danger of the far right, the ways in which they get into formal politics to pull them ever more rightwards. And that's what they're clearly doing absolutely successfully." And I just want to pause at this moment to really think about, and you see this across the data in our interviews, is how even though the far right has been, well, we'll debate about how normalized the far right is. I maintain that it's now just part, almost banal in being part of kind of the European scene. But we forget that the far right represents an existential threat to people of color and women of color in particular. And as it's normalized, what we find is that it generates this deep anxiety. And this activist goes on to talk about how you always have to be in this kind of emergency crisis mindset because the far right is insidious and gets themselves into kind of everyday life, into football, and they're kind of colonizing kind of left and right mainline political parties. So you can't ever relax, and you have to be met. They have to be met at every point. So she's one of these kind of, she's a young person, but she's still like part of that old school anti-fascist organizing in terms of you meet the fascists at every single point. You meet them at every point. You give them no quarter. They must be confronted and pushed back always, because if you don't do that, they take over. And it's impossible to always be in a crisis mindset like that. It's impossible to relax. And trying to understand a political moment in which you can't ever relax, because if you do, that is a genuine existential threat to you, that matters. So the House of Commons library every few years produces its own kind of hate crime statistics. And so this activist is talking about a context in which, we've seen like this 50% spike in hate crimes in the United Kingdom at the moment that she's speaking. So this is a very real thing in terms of violence in the streets, but then also other policies and practices. You guys will see that kind of our kind of home office minister, our kind of head of the Home Office, Secretary of State, the Home Office is, is kind of this hardcore Brexiteer, and she's very proud and happy to kind of be forcing Britain out of the EU, which is very interesting, and so represents a very interesting kind of far-right politician. All right, let me give you another example of what this looks like, because I think it muddies the waters and laying blame solely at the far right, which I think is really interesting. So this is a queer Latin American migrants' rights activist who does a lot of very interesting organizing work with migrants. So works a lot with kind of care workers, because they're such an important part of the caring economy in the Spanish context, and also does some very interesting kind of radical lifestyle stuff, but we can talk about that another time. So she says this, quote, "I am not afraid if Vox comes to power." And so for those who don't know, Vox is kind of the new far-right party, political entrepreneur upstart. And it was thought they were going to make this big breakthrough in Spanish politics at this moment. So she says this, "I'm not afraid if Vox comes to power because the administrative protocol is more racist. The administrative protocol of the schools, the protocol of the university. I don't have the possibility of accrediting everything I studied or everything I learned in my country of origin. We have neither the right to scholarships nor access to universities or something that will allow us to make a qualitative leap forward in this country." And I think this is just so important to understand. So just so you know, so I'm an American and I've been like following US politics and not sleeping at night and, anxious, and anxiety ridden about kind of the kind of collective nervous breakdown of my country. And part of the reason why people voted for Joe Biden was they were voting for normality. They wanted things to go back to normal. They're tired of the chaos, tired of this man. They just want him out of here so we can get back to the way that America used to be. You're probably wondering why I'm saying this, because the point is the same here. So this activist is like, yes, Vox is terrible, but Vox isn't the only problem here. The normal everyday politics of the mainline political parties in Spain at this moment make my life hell. And that's the point, that it's not merely the far right, it's both mainline parties and their policies that seek to undermine and make life even more precarious. And this is what structural exhaustion looks like. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. So one more point on structural exhaustion, especially from the German context, because I think it's very, very interesting what this activist is saying. So this is actually a Black woman who is from, I'll just say North America, and she's living in Berlin, because you guys know there are lots of, Berlin is like this tech sector and all the rest of it. So it's a very interesting group of activists who are in this city, and they talk a lot about kind of their passport privilege, right? Because they are not refugees and asylum seekers, they're migrant workers, and it's very interesting to how that changes, but also interesting does not change how their experiences in Europe at this moment. So she says this, which I think is very, very interesting. She says, quote, "So all the shit that Black people experience in Germany is in our email inbox. And then it's just like me thinking, actually, I want to help all of these people. I want to give them something somehow, like give them a structure with which they can work or get access to something. But I don't have that myself, Then you have to accept that you just can't help all of them. We can't replace a state institution. I'm feeling hopeless at the moment. I'm so pessimistic about everything." And I just think this is a really important point. So this is someone who talks quite a lot in her interview, talks quite a lot about how she doesn't have it as bad because she has, because she has this kind of passport privilege and it's important to her and all the rest of it. And she kind of works for a large anti-racist organization that's underfunded, understaffed, and they're trying to do their best, but they can't because the situation in Germany is so tense. And especially at this moment where, and in the German interviews, it's so interesting that the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is just always in the peripheral vision of exerting this kind of anxiety, this violence, and this threat for these activists, which demands exhaustion. You know, so this activist goes on to talk about how she's been doxxed, she's constantly getting death threats, all of these kinds of things, merely for saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be so racist, which I find fascinating. But this is what structural exhaustion looks like, right? She's so pessimistic, she's so beat down because the problems of kind of economic insecurity, structural racism, all of these things are not being addressed at the local and at the municipal level. And it's kind of put on this kind of like poorly funded organization to try to solve the problems of all Black people in Germany. Okay, so I want to just show you now, okay, I'm just checking the time here. Okay, I think I'm going to get my timing right. So I just want to show you now 3 examples of kind of exhausting solidarity. Solidarity is exhausting because I think the structural exhaustion is important as context to understand what activists then do with that. Because the great caricature of how women of color organize in Europe in particular is this idea of, oh, this identity politics, you're fracturing the left, you have no class analysis, blah, 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 blah. Well, guess what? Anyone who actually speaks to any of these activists know that that's bullshit, frankly. And I'm here to show you what it means when activists are working in multiracial, multi-class, multi-ethnic coalitions and how they are repelled from building solidarity. Because again and again, well, that's a good introduction, and I'm just going to read these quotes and then we'll talk about it. So this idea that somehow women of color are kind of fracturing coalitions, you know, are kind of engaged, are in their safe spaces, not wanting to engage, is absolutely not the case. The reaching out, the focus on trying to build connections, trying to build networks, trying to build a sense of collective identity and thus mobilize people to action is repelled again and again and again. And Leah and I have been working on this for 10 years, and it's not surprising, but it's still deeply disappointing that we literally could have done all of this work. All of these things could have been said to us 10 years ago. And it's fascinating to see how little has changed. And I think that's something very important about so-called European values. So this is a French Maghrebi feminist activist who is a long-time activist in the trade union scene, was around with Mechelon and his whole crew of characters. And so she is deeply involved with the French left. And she's horrified, exhausted, and bitter about it. And here's what she said, quote, "I learned a lot of things about the left and its limits. I learned a lot of things about the profound lack of humility of the radical left in France, and of the tropes they still have, that it is upper middle class white men who think they're gonna save everyone else." Again and again and again, this idea of a failure of solidarity, of people in these ostensibly radical, sometimes revolutionary, but majority white spaces, and being talked down to, patronized, told to shut up, and silenced from these ostensibly radical spaces is repeated again and again and again across all 6 sites. And it says something profoundly important about what solidarity actually looks like in activist spaces. Because, you look at mainline political groups and parties and stuff, and you're like, well, it's this fight for the center. You don't want to offend the median voter and all the rest of it. But in spaces that are supposed to know better, what you see is the same kind of violence. And that's the issue. All right, let me show you another example of what this looks like. And so this is a Danish-Turkish anti-racist activist. So they are a Danish citizen, but they do quite a lot of migrants' rights activism work. And for the Danish context, you guys may or may not know, there's this kind of very strange ghetto package, and in order to kind of integrate or better integrate kind of racialized groups into Danish society. And so they do a lot of work trying to undermine the so-called ghetto package. And it just kind of makes me think that maybe the Danes have some thinking to do when you would call any policy a ghetto package. But that's another story. All right, so this is, I think, builds on what the French activist was talking about in her context. So this is a very different context, right? And here's something very similar being said. So this activist says this, she says, quote, "I think the people we have in the group are allies. I don't think the organization is an ally. I think that they would like to think that they are, but they're not, because they're not willing to acknowledge some of the things that they do are problematic. They're not willing to sort of see us or take us seriously. They're very patronizing. So it's very hard for them to let go. It's very hard for them to receive criticism because they see themselves as not like the other organizations. It is not allyship. They're trying to have this sort of paternalistic relationship with us where they want to control what we do." Literally for 10 years, I've been hearing the same thing of folks, women of color, wanting to work in solidarity in these kind of really big, diverse coalitions and being told to shut up and go away. Shut up and go away because the women want to discuss their intersecting inequalities, saying that you must, whether you like it or not, take seriously the intersections of race, class, and gender and legal status. And women of color demurring and in fact refusing to engage in Islamophobia and racist rhetoric and stereotypes in order to gain a foothold and to be heard and listened to in these spaces. My colleague Leah Bassel has done quite a lot of this work comparing especially France and Canada, and she has this great quote where she's interviewing another activist who says, "They only listen to us when we bash our culture." And so this idea for those activists who aren't going to play those kinds of games in order to get status in these groups, what we see is they're met with kind of these patronizing attitudes, people who don't want to be self-reflective and are kind of deeply paternalistic because they don't actually believe that women of color are legitimate political agents. All right, last slide and then we're out of here. So even though the research, our research sites were based in the Belgian case, were based in Brussels mostly in Francophone Belgium, there's a whole group of very cool activists in Antwerp that you guys may or may not know. And so I thought I would pull from that, from some of the Flemish data so you can see what's happening kind of in your backyard. And I thought you guys might find this interesting. It's horrifying, but I thought you just might find it interesting and nice that people aren't always talking about Brussels, and so you can hear what's happening kind of in the Flemish area. So this is what a queer African migrant is talking about in terms of their experience in seeking coalition, particularly on LGBTQI issues and rights. So they say this, they say, quote, "There's still racism within the LGBTQI community, and it's ridiculous for me. How can you be in an oppressed group and be an oppressor yourself? So it strikes me that solidarity is very difficult. Unless people are trying to hook up with Black people, as in have a relationship with, have sex with, that's when they'll pretend to be allies. But other than that, it's very difficult to be in solidarity. The trust is really broken, you know, because we're thinking, are you really an ally?" And this is what we see again and again and again. And the way that homo nationalism is mobilized, particularly in the Low Countries, I think is actually very, very important here, of this need of using LGBT rights to pinkwash really horrific racism and Islamophobia in the name of solidarity, I think is something that really does bear some folks to kind of some deep reflection on. And it was really nice to hear from Heleen where the next seminar is actually going to be on this point. So it's very interesting. So it's just kismet to kind of flag this for you, because the ways in which LGBT rights are secured in the European context oftentimes requires throwing Muslim groups under the bus. And then what happens to those queer Muslim refugees, asylum seekers, but also European citizens, which I think is very important. What happens to those people who live at the intersections of these structures? What happens to them? So gonna finish up now. Final slide is that women of color are exhausted. Folks are tired. The current situation, the current context, the current conjuncture means folks are exhausted. They're also tired of their comrades' bullshit. They're tired of it, tired of the nonsense. And what we know is this is leading to burnout, it's leading to pessimism. And I have another talk, another paper that Heleen heard me give when in Amsterdam last year about how this exhaustion oftentimes generates new kinds of activism, which means that people are actually going underground and are kind of refusing these kinds of politics altogether and are kind of doing work under the radar because they're tired of all this nonsense. And I think it's what's really important in this context about talking about solidarity and European values and all the rest of it is we need to take this exhaustion seriously and we need to understand what this exhaustion signifies. That, you know, as I say, exhaustion is not only, but it's important actually, it's not only an individualized emotional response to crisis, emotional response to these bad times. These are bad times that we're in, but it's also an interpellation. And I think that's really important. Folks are hailing each other. They're hailing each other. Exhaustion is simultaneously an aspiration to solidarity, but it's also, as I've shown you, kind of bitter disappointment in the failure of solidarity work, particularly with revolutionary white allies who supposedly should know better. Okay, I'm finished there. Thanks so much, you guys. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Akwugo. I just want to say that I will collect questions for Akwugo in the chat, and we will post them to Akwugo in the Q&A. And I will now give the word to Heleen.
Hi, everyone. It is very difficult to give a response to something you completely agree with, and also when you're yourself very exhausted. So I hope you will give me some slack on this one. I can't speak from a research perspective. I'm not an academic, so I can't like do any interpolations on that point. But I can talk about, maybe pick up from where Akwugo's research ended, was with January, and talk a little bit about how the last year has been. For a lot of Black activists or activists of sub-Saharan African descent in Belgium. And this idea of exhaustion as a structure has come to the forefront in ways that in my personal life, but also around me with other people, activists, writers, all kinds of people who are working around these subjects in a way that I never thought was possible. First, when we had, of course, we have to talk about COVID and the first lockdown and the things that happened during the first lockdown. I don't remember if you recall the death of Adil, a young boy who was killed after a police chase. Afterwards, the death of Akram, someone who was also killed during an interaction with the police. And these are like these big moments when you have to all get fired up and come together and give energy to a cause. And I can really tell that it's become more and more difficult to do that. Specifically, when I talk about people who are working with people who have been illegalized, so people who do not have residency status in Belgium, specifically in Brussels. I don't know how it is in different cities, but the way things were happening here when the lockdown hit first time, there was no support network, there was nothing happening. So it was citizens who were having to make sure that people had places where they could clean themselves, places where they could eat, that they would not get fines for being out on the street because you were not allowed to be on the street. So that was like also happening at the same time. And then the death of George Floyd and sort of the waking up of Belgian media. So you have all these things happen in a Belgian context. No real attention is given, but a lot of energy is required from us. And then we have this death of George Floyd. And I can tell you personally, I got about, and I work as a journalist, and I got about maybe 9 to 10 calls a day from national media, which is impossible if you're working, first off. Secondly, maybe find someone else. Thirdly, it's extremely tiring. And I remember that time, like that whole month of, we were just all scrolling, like the whole time we were just scrolling to social media, trying to find ways to talk to each other, not really finding a way to talk to each other. And recently, a friend of mine sent me this thing. It's a concept. It's called Acadia or Acedia. It's from a monk and theologian from the 5th century. And it is this emotion. And it's the way that he describes it is it's like it's a mind seized by its emotion. It's horrified at where it is. It is disgusted with his room. It does not allow him to stay or her in his cell or devote any effort to reading. It's a body that feels completely devoid of energy, but at the same time is extremely active in the mind, but has no way of giving outlet to that. And I feel that that describes a lot of people's exhaustion at that time. I don't know. We were having a lot of like conversations. I don't know if anyone in this group can connect to that feeling where you're just like, you're trying to give some kind of expression to something, but you don't, first of all, trust the ways of expression that are available to you, either being it traditional media, either being it social media, whatever it might be, or you don't have energy or space to give all these emotions and thoughts, give them coherence. So for me personally, it has been a very difficult year because I, for one, have been subscribing to the gospel of doubt. And I think that's one way of battling fatigue for myself, is to doubt almost everything and everyone who comes my way, and give myself space to doubt these people. I do understand the fact that this idea of fatigue can connect, but I feel at this, I don't know if we've come, like, if we've crossed like a critical point, but I feel like a whole generation of thinkers and activists are burning out completely. I don't know if this happened specifically because of Corona, but when I talk about Belgium, Corona, Adil, Akram, the protests, the reaction to the protests, the fact that nothing politically has happened on that front, I feel like everything just, most people I know have just like said, I'm kind of done. I can't do this anymore. And I cannot disagree with them. At the same time, we had this whole outpouring of support because, you know, when Black Lives Matter in the States, I guess they do for like a month too in Belgium, which was interesting. It was like the reinvention that racism exists here too, episode 2500. And it was very, I don't like to use this word, but very triggering to then see the progression within like the space of a couple of months, where you had this outpouring of support, the black tiles, everything was happening, people were changing their names on all the social medias to Black Lives Matter, all that stuff, to then people doubting the fact that racism can be systemic and institutional racism and stuff like that, to then again specifically, as Akwugo had mentioned, people on the left doubting that experience, putting that experience again into a space of where we have to reflect about it, again, trying to re-examine our history, which, for the record, historians have definitely exclaimed that what happened in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Burundi, was a massive violation of human rights. People were really trying to re-examine those things again, and really trying to push those people who they had hailed as visionary voices 2 months earlier, attacking them. So that went really quick. And that's a very interesting thing for us, because at the time I was personally feeling like, I'm so tired, I can't do this. I'm like taking my public energy out of this, and I'm like dividing it internally amongst friends and like-minded people. And I cannot like, go on TV shows and write articles and stuff like that. No, I'll just do my job and think about these issues amongst friends. And then you see the people who were coming out being then, attacked for it 2-3 months later by the same people who were hailing them. One example, I'm going to call him out by name, is Professor Jan Dumoulin from the University of Ghent, who attacked another university professor, Nadia Fadil, publicly on social media in very, very harsh terms, called her an extremist, an Islam extremist, because she dared to doubt the efficacy of French policies with regards to the Islamic community in that country, in the wake of the recent attacks in France. So it's not even like a very, what you would call, problematic opinion or something, just a very like, maybe France can do better on that point. And he called her out everywhere. It was really, really bad. And this same professor is the one who keeps accusing people, historians, sociologists, all kinds of people who are doing this work on identity issues, as being exclusionary because we are dividing the class struggle. And this is like, this whole notion of fatigue and solidarity is exhausting, is something that would like, I mean, it wouldn't work, but it would be interesting to put that against him. And many of his compatriots, because he's not alone, of course, in that. And I want to subscribe to the idea of that we can create new spaces through solidarity in exhaustion, but those spaces are under constant attack. First of all, it is almost impossible to create a safe space. I don't really subscribe to that concept, because there are always people of different privilege levels in a space. And as someone, I am mixed race, I have a Flemish name, I have a residency, I was born in Belgium. I am often one of those people who has high privilege in a space. And I see also how other people of high privilege act in those spaces. And, we're kind of trash. So like, let's call ourselves out here and just also be, and also this idea, this thing with safe spaces is also something where you have like what we would call kind of the Black elite, which is like these people who are writers, these people who are eloquent, these people who are thinkers, public speakers, stuff like that, who often are more well off, in a more privileged position, taking space from people who are in more precarious socioeconomic situations, and who are in more, who also have less access to that kind of language. So I feel like also in those safe spaces, there is when like that we can exclude people because they don't have the same lingo. So for example, in Belgium, we used blanc. In Flanders, we used blanc to describe white people. A lot of activists don't do that. A lot of thinkers don't do that. They use the word white, with, to describe white people. And so, but then when a person of color uses the word blanc, maybe because they're not like, you know, haven't read everything there is to read, they are all already like put aside because they're not maybe woke enough, I don't know, or intelligent enough, or haven't read up on the issues enough. So I think that those are quite dangerous situations. I also work in an organization, an arts organization that focuses its energy on newly arrived people. So that those are often people who have been illegalized. It's very difficult. In English, we'd say, in Dutch, we would say illegaliseerd. In English, that's, I guess, legalized. It is very interesting that when, for example, we come up with, in the organization, we come up with the idea, oh, we want to maybe do something around Leopold II, because all these people were talking about it, and you know, there was a whole like public discourse happening, and these people were like, no, we don't want to do that because that's not safe for us. And you could definitely tell that there was energy inside the organization to do it anyway, because, you know, it's cool now to do this. But for those people who are in very precarious situations, they are like, no, we don't fuck with that. No, leave us alone. We are just trying to survive. We are trying to be safe. We're trying to have a house over, a roof over our heads. So all that to say that I want to believe in the idea that fatigue is like solidarity to exhaustion can be an engine for something, but there is like a very narrow space where that can happen. And I feel honestly like 2020 pushed us over, but maybe this is me being overly pessimistic. But just like a little anecdote to end my ramblings here is that when we do create that space, right? I had like a small gathering for my birthday. It was the 24th of June, so we were allowed to have 10 people outside. So I had 10 people outside in my garden. A couple of people left. We were still just talking. It was 11 in the evening. This is just like a moment of bonding, a bunch of Black people together, having fun, not music, nothing loud going on. The police show up. So then that's like, yeah, I mean, how safe can a space be? When, yeah, the police can show up. Now I could prevent them from entering my house because I'm also a very bratty person, but that could have gone wrong, and I have a lot of privilege and I used it, but that could have gone wrong in a lot of ways. So just to end where, on a negative note, and give some questions with this idea of creating those spaces.
Thank you, Heleen, for that response to Akwugo's lecture. I will take a look at the questions that I've collected. People are, of course, feel free to add any questions that you might have and that you might want to see answered. The first question that came in was not actually a question, it's more of a remark by Doreen de Troyes, who wanted to say that the politics of exhaustion reminded her of the work of Pascal Chabot, The Philosophy of Burnout.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, just to say that and it's my issue, but I also think it's a broader thing, that I really resist a lot of the work that's done on kind of emotions and affect, because many of these authors, scholars have not done enough to think about the racialized aspects. And so, yes, I am in no way claiming that this is new or all the rest of it, but there's an entire literature that takes gender seriously, but does not take race seriously. And so I'm very skeptical. So I'll just put that up, just so you know, so you guys are clear about where I'm coming from with that. But thank you.
Thanks. Ilaria has 2 questions. And the first one is, could you say more about working with social media data as a methodology for studying social movements? And the second one is, can you elaborate on your first definition of exhaustion as a form of solidarity? And she goes on to say that, is there a performative element to that? And what are the consequences of using exhaustion as a basis for solidarity or mobilization?
That's a good question. So in terms of social media as integrating that into kind of our kind of qualitative project, it was actually really interesting because what it did was it provided a lot more context, and it also showed a lot of the creativity that the activists engaged in trying to kind of bring to light a number of different issues. So a couple of things. So there were kind of real kind of methodological problems in terms of people posting things and then those things disappear after 24 hours, or people delete their accounts, or they lock their accounts and all the rest of it. So trying to keep track of the data and dealing with ephemeral data is actually something that's very interesting and kind of and is worth kind of thinking about. There are kind of ethical issues about, because for those who know or don't know, there are these kind of Europe-wide locked Instagram, Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups that are actually really important. And it was a genuine kind of ethical dilemma for us of knowing that these groups exist. I'm part of some of them. But saying, no, just like as Heleen was saying, like there is no safe space, that it was a genuine kind of ethical dilemma to say, do you mine those spaces for data? And for our purposes, we didn't want to do that because that would have been a real violation for those activists who were hoping to have these very real conversations without being surveilled. I do think but I think people often should take surveillance more seriously in those spaces anyway, because not everyone is who they say they are. But anyway, that's something that it was actually really interesting and important. But then you also see the creative ways in which activists kind of are talking about issues, because being trolled and being doxxed is just part of the everyday life of an activist. The ways in which especially kind of the French activists were talking about things. So in order to talk about issues like, so just to name, just this very particular context is just quite funny. So when people wanted to talk, when these kind of Afrofeminist activists wanted to talk about whiteness and kind of white folks on Instagram and on Twitter, they wouldn't say, Blanc or whatever, because, people have kind of notifications to try to check all those things in order to troll. So they would just leave a blank space, which is, which is so smart. It's like, blah, 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 blank, because, the whiteness of the blank shows you what this is. And it's these smart ways, it's just like activists are so great. Do you know what I mean? Of like just these really smart ways in which to kind of navigate, to be able to have a public conversation about these very real issues. It's just stuff like that. I just think it's so cool. So anyway, it's just, yeah. So I mean, there are no great insights. Anyone who does any kind of digital research will have encountered many of these issues. But it's, for me, what's very interesting is to think about the ethical dilemmas of being in private spaces, and then also the ephemeral nature of so much of social media data, because so much of it isn't archived. And I wish that the activists would, because those archives matter in terms of kind of the memory of these moments. I think is actually very interesting. So in terms of thinking about exhaustion and solidarity, just very briefly, exhaustion there is a performance aspect, right? So if you're interpolating someone, right, you're saying this, you're articulating this, and you're trying to hail someone. And so there is a performance, right? It's not that it's not genuine, but when you say that, you're also trying to see whether the person, your interlocutor, understands what you're talking about. it's like a code word. It's almost like a shibboleth, you know? It's like it's a code word for whether you're part of this group, which I think is very interesting, because if you kind of go, oh no, what does that mean? I don't get it. Then you're not part of this, you don't get it. And we're gonna keep it moving. But to say you're exhausted means, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. And then what it does, it unlocks another and more interesting conversation, because it never stops at I'm so tired, because of course everyone's tired, right? But it unlocks a way to talk about the problems of working with a whole bunch of activists who are wild and out. Or it unlocks a lot of different ways, many of the issues that Heleen raised in her kind of response. So that's the point of it, that of course it's performative. When you're in these spaces, you're trying to find a point of connection with people beyond the work that you do. And this is a really nice, it functions as a really nice shortcut for folks, right? And also there is this bonding of like, if you're kind of literally, you know, physically and mentally fatigued by the work that you're doing, that is a point of course, that's a deep bonding moment, because that's how you know you're kind of doing the right thing, because you're, you know, and kind of, especially for those who do direct action, putting your body on the line, that phrase really means something. So this is you literally putting your body on the line for those that you care about and those who are despised by kind of the powers that be. So that's how it operates.
Okay. Then a question from Desiree Gaudio. So what kind of new forms of activism are fostering exhaustion?
Well, I don't know if exhaustion fosters new form of, oh, okay, I see what they mean. So, okay, I was like, so I think it's important to understand that activists are oftentimes presented with a choice, and it's like a forked road kind of thing. As Heleen says, and I'd like to get back out into, and I will be going back out into the field to test this, that there's a huge number of people who burn out and leave the activist milieu. That absolutely happens. That people, because so many of the activists I spoke with, I think the vast majority of them were in precarious employment or freelance and all the rest. So, you know, so the activism is something you do on the side, but you literally can't afford to feed yourself or keep yourself in your home kind of thing. And that is such an important part of the burnout dynamic that I think is genuinely underappreciated, you know? And it's actually very interesting, with the exception of London. A lot of these kind of capital cities are, relatively speaking, quite cheap to live in. London is my measure for so many of these places, and so it's not the same at all as how expensive it is in London. Anyway, that's another story. But what that means is people are able to kind of walk this line. And what we see is, especially now with the pandemic, people have fallen off, right? Because it's just an impossible tightrope. And that's part of the reason why they leave. And they leave for lots of different reasons as a result of that. But then what you also see, and I think it's important to understand that people aren't just exhausted and then they leave, although that is a big group of people, and it has huge implications for activist memory, and it has huge implications for archives, because what you find is you have this new group of people constantly coming in, and no one is really learning from the past, because everyone's gone off somewhere. Definitely. Yeah, you see, okay, so you see, so this is, and that's that's one of the huge implications, very real material and discursive implication of exhaustion. But what you also see is this politics of refusal. So people saying, I am tired of this nonsense. I'm tired of working with the so-called revolutionary white folks who still, for some reason in 2020, do not understand what race is and how race operates. Or particularly in Francophone Europe, where race literally does not exist. So people are tired of the bullshit. And what they're doing is they're exiting these coalition spaces, and they're working on their own under the radar of the state, under the radar of these big coalitions, and most importantly, under the radar of the white gaze. They do not want to be controlled or captured by the white gaze. And that's what you see happening. And it's very interesting. I have a paper coming out to talk about that And
isn't there this thing like the right to be unknown or the right to be obscure or something?
yes, that's exactly right, to be marginalized. And so it's that idea of taking that marginalization to heart, of saying like, I'm not going to just be in this coalition and just be pushed off to the side. I'm going to take you at your word, get out of the space and start doing things on my own terms, which I think is a very interesting, and I think we would do well to try to well, I mean, it's going to be hard to map because by the very nature, it's under the radar and invisible, but it's really important to understand that there are folks doing things and they are deliberately obscuring what they're doing, which I think is important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask a little question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think like also when you say like it's like a performance and then the other person understands immediately what you're talking about and stuff like that, isn't that also like a way in which you can tell that new people have entered a space, is that they're not tired?
That you're like the old lady, you're like, oh, back in my day.
I'm 32 years old, like, and I'm like pretty new to this and I'm super tired, but then, you know, there's still younger people coming in and
it's true.
They have so much energy.
Like, you're like a veteran. You can be like, I remember when all this was fields.
That is definitely gonna be me. I'm already like this right
That's
now.
right.
Okay, we have a couple more. There was a message by Artemis Kubala for you, Heleen, which is more of a message. Or maybe she would like to talk to you about this. She says that, I totally agree when you say I'm done. And for me, De meeste mensen deugen, written by Rutger Bregman, is a book that brings a little bit of healing and helps me snap out of being immobilized by the multitude and the exhaustion.
Like economist guy who's like made his name by going to the that forum thing.
Yeah,
he has some really weird stuff to. Like, he's a weirdo. Like, I don't know if that's a.
Yeah, he's not.
It's being recorded. Please edit that out. But anyways,
I can.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have to cut all this off. No, I mean, honestly, like I'm going to be very frank about this. I think Bregman has a lot of methodological and deontological issues in his work. He claims other people's work as his own, which I find to be a big problem as a journalist. And he has, he uses that phrase, well, most people are okay, like kind of okay, as a way to silence people who criticize his work. So I do like, I haven't read the book yet, and I am not planning on doing it anytime soon. I hope if it gives you solace, don't, I guess, death of the author, like ignore whoever he is as a person, like we do with a lot of people, because otherwise we couldn't read like half the books we own. Chimamanda Ngozi, one example.
What a shame, honestly. But I just to say, as no, I'm not surprised. Just so anyway,
no, but she's been problematic for a very long time.
Honestly, anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Okay, but
I think
for me that
wasn't space for this discussion.
That is not a healing practice. Reading someone like that. What I have experienced I could maybe talk a little bit about what I have experienced as healing.
Yeah, sure.
So this is like super weird, but I really enjoy watching like British crime series with detectives, not cops, but detectives, and like so many people die and no one seems to care. It is so weird. Like in a Poirot episode, right?
Yeah.
At least 5 people die.
Do you mean Midsummer Murders?
Yeah, but Midsummer Murders is like kind of trash because the guy is like super misogynistic and stuff. Yeah. So then that's annoying. But like Poirot, he's like a super nice detective, or Miss Marple, like she's also like a super nice lady. They're not like super problematic figures in themselves. And then so many people die, and then the British are like, they don't cry or they don't like seem to care. So then I just felt like, okay, death is relative. I can enjoy life again. I don't know. Hey, that was like a thing that I did to enjoy myself and feel better about the world, I guess, in a
great,
weird
watching people be murdered.
contradictory way.
There's a lot to unpack there, I feel, yeah.
But that was like a lot of private information.
Yeah, we should definitely cut out the discussion, I think. Hafsa has actually the $1 million question, because she asks, how do you think we could solve this exhaustion? And then she says, okay, maybe we shouldn't be solving it, but maybe we can take a stab at solving it.
Well, I mean, look, exhaustion ends when we find kind of anti-capitalist responses. Exhaustion ends when we dismantle white supremacy. Exhaustion ends when we when we stop the securitization of the European border. And hey, guess what? Other countries relieve kind of Southern Europe of hosting huge numbers of asylum seekers, and folks take seriously their so-called European solidarity and their obligation to other people, especially those who do not enjoy European citizenship rights. Like, you know, nothing here is a mystery about, that doesn't mean that new problems won't then arise. But look, this isn't a huge mystery, but people are exhausted because, oh, you know, like, like the three parts of this puzzle, Europe is nowhere close to this, right? You know, I will start feeling better when when countries collect race statistics. We're not even at that point. We're not even at that point to even collect these statistics so you can actually measure what racial discrimination looks like, even though we know it all exists in employment, in housing, all the rest of it. The fact, and so it's this, until there's a confrontation with this, I think, quite basic point, and then it's not treated as, oh, this is the imposition of American race relations in Europe. Until we kind of get to that point, we're not talking about trying to solve exhaustion. So for me, it's actually very straightforward, but there's a resistance because in order to confront these things means that people are going to have to give up their very cherished European values, because to understand what European modernity is, to understand this idea of liberal democracy, lives on the bones of colonialism and those who were subject to that. So, but folks aren't willing to have that conversation. So let's get real, you know?
But I do have a question when it comes to like those race statistics, because I do think like it is something like that in Belgium, a lot of people have been trying to get. And I remember writing an article about this, this whole endeavor maybe like 4 years ago. And since then, I've worked and written a lot of articles with the Rome community in Brussels, and they specifically do not want that to happen, because there has been some issues in Italy, I think, where they were registering that ethnicity for people and things went wrong, and then it was used as a way to then persecute people. And that is a big fear inside that community. And when we relate that to that, like right to be unseen or I guess
forgotten, yeah.
No, right to be forgotten is privacy, right? It's I mean like this idea that you can work in the shadows and not be visible, and that you don't have to, you don't owe anyone access or explanation. Like, how do you weigh those two against each other? I mean, I'm just conflicted on it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I don't want to kind of say to another group, you know, you must submit to being persecuted. I kind of think that the state was going to come after them regardless, because all you have to do is see people's names or use a migration history or background or use geographical data, right? So it's not an imperfect, so there are other ways of doing it, right? But it seems to me this is such a basic point about making claims to the state and making claims to a certain kind of imperfect equality, that if you literally, so take the kind of French case at the moment where people are saying structural racism does not exist, but somehow cannot explain why we see these huge unemployment rates amongst kind of amongst kind of Black French and Maghrebi French people. We can't seem to understand why we have this high level of residential segregation. It's all a mystery. Who can say? Maybe these people, you know, and so it perpetuates these bad faith conversations about, I don't know why there are no kind of Black, you know, and why are Black women driven out of academia on the continent and all the rest of it? Who can say? It's a mystery. So it perpetuates a bad faith conversation from the beginning. And I guess I would always say, and I said this at a talk in Germany, and I'll say it here, that part of an anti-fascist response is not to let a fascist history control the way that you think about issues of race and racism. Okay. Like, you can talk about all of these things without kind of like defaulting to kind of like kind of fascist Germany and fascist Italy. Do you know what I mean? These two things are not the same. And to pretend as if Europe does not have a particular kind of racialization that has very real material effects is nonsense. It's nonsense. And for social scientists to collude in this is ridiculous. So I will always go against the wall. It doesn't mean that things are perfect. I'm an American living in Britain, and it's not like, you know, these places are free of racism, but at least we can have more honest and different and more upsetting conversations. But at least we're not having this conversation about whether race exists or not. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is ridiculous. Definitely.
I mean, it was such a watershed moment when this report from the Koning Boudewijn Stichting came out that had, you obviously know which one I'm referring to. And I think most of the people probably do here too. And that had like quantifiable data, and like for the first time, like people had something to like push in people's faces. That was like a big moment. I can really remember how intense that was.
Okay, we're approaching the 7:30 mark. We have two more questions. The first one is from Esther. I'll keep them separate because they're really different questions. Esther asks, the idea of exhaustion as a teacher is a very interesting idea. Can you show how this may show activists the possibilities of their solidarity work apart from the limits?
Oh, sorry. That's the first question. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for sure. There's so in some of the more I'm happy people were like, show us some positive things, tell us some positive stories. That's fine. Good for you. I like to wallow in the badness because it makes me feel better. Like, but like,
yeah.
But there are of course lots of positive things, because it's interesting, because you know how I said activists are kind of approach a fork in the road where some people burn out and then leave the scene, and then other people try to work creatively. There are absolutely, especially in the German data, it's very interesting, but that's that Teutonic pragmatism, I think, that what you see in the German data in particular are folks who experience this kind of failure of solidarity in these kind of radical spaces. But as soon as they move into other kinds of spaces, especially around issues and you see this in the UK context as well, especially around very concrete material issues about kind of defending a service, defending like a library, defending kind of or defending kind of workers' rights, when there's something very material, people are able to navigate these issues and problems much more easily than say, okay, we've had this giant demonstration about Black Lives Matter, and now we have these people together, what are we going to do? So there is something here about how, with the exception of those activists who I think rightly so are kind of refusing or kind of now under the radar, there are some activists who said, okay, we need to kind of ground our activism in a slightly different way to make this more particularly about kind of fighting for kind of migrant workers' rights and expanding their rights. And so it's an issue that deals with intersectional inequalities, but then is also somehow material, and I don't know, I guess satisfies kind of these white leftists or something. So you can see that there are these spaces and places, but that is in no way the majority of the people who we spoke with. So some people are able to make it happen, other people are still in despair. And I think we should just sit with the despair and think about what is that? And I would argue that's maybe a European value. So
sitting with despair, I love it.
Okay, last question. by Guido. Guido is asking, what can a white male privileged person do to be accepted and trusted in an anti-racist, anti-discriminatory movement or action? And he goes on to say, with some irony, I would say it sounds quite exhausting to even try it. I hope nobody gets shocked by the question. After all, Jesus chose a tax clerk as a follower.
I'd like to know who Jesus is in this analogy here. But anyway, that's another story. So like this also isn't rocket science. What we see again and again and again is like, so take the French Maghreb activist I was talking to about saying how she was shocked by the deep lack of humility on the activist left. So the first point is the point I've been saying for years. Don't be an asshole. Don't be a jerk. People don't want to hear, but that's actually the most difficult thing in the world is don't be a jerk. If you're going to be in these spaces, let people speak. Do not think that you're a savior. Propose some ideas. Maybe, and if you're a privileged, I don't like using that word, but if that means that you're like middle class or whatever and you have money, donate money, give money. That's what a lot of these activists say again and again and again. They're doing so much of this work on shoestrings. One of the best things you can do is give people your money. Like that is so important.
But also give people your money and do not attach any requirements to how they spend that money.
That's it. Listen to your girl here. She knows what's up. So like, no, give your money. Don't look for people to say, oh, thank you, all that kind of stuff. Do it, no strings attached. That's very, very helpful. And also do a lot of the grunt work. So many of these activists talk about having to kind of do all this, you know, answering emails, doing this. If you could step up and do the administrative work of activism, all the unsexy stuff, everyone wants to be in a street with a placard, but no one wants to clean up afterwards or plan beforehand. Everyone just wants to be there and look cool, but no one wants to do the caring, the invisible caring labor that makes all of these actions possible. You put your energy in there, that will go a long way of making people trust you. But you have to do the work. Don't be talking over people and all the rest of it. I mean, but it is not within, someone was talking before about performance. In these spaces, there's so much performance happening because people feel very insecure in these spaces. They want to show how radical they are. And I think if people wanted to be less radical, but just wanted to just do meaningful work, that would go a long way for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, can I just add also to that I think it's interesting that you phrased the question, what can a white male privileged person do to be accepted and trusted in an anti-racist, anti-discriminatory movement or action, instead of what can we do as an action? Because I think it is not your right, nor should it be, to be accepted or trusted. So like that is something that can be a consequence, but it is not something that comes first. So I do think like the way you think about that could maybe like also influence the way you act upon it. Like do the groundwork, don't try to take up space or be like accepted and trusted. Just start with the basics and support people, and then maybe that will come. Maybe it won't, depending on who you are individually. I don't know you, of course, and I'm not one to judge a person's character via Zoom. But I think that that's an important aspect too, is that there's a lot of people who come, do like the minimal work and ask to be accepted and trusted immediately. That is something that will not happen. That doesn't even happen for other people of color. We don't just all come together and all trust and accept each other. No, you do the work and then you will be trusted or accepted depending on your behavior.
Then since we're talking Bible stuff, I know you want to wrap it up, but like, isn't it like, what is the biblical, like, you will know him you'll know them by their deeds or whatever? So like, get in there. So like, we can all do this Bible thing. So yeah, so like, get in there and do the work. And then like, and by doing, you build trust. I mean, again, this isn't rocket science.
It's not rocket science. And I don't think it's particular to the anti-racist movement either. I mean, if you want to join a movement on any other issue, you have to do the work too. So, and you have to build trust. So, yeah. Okay, I think that was it. We answered the last question. Thank you so much There's another question.
No, it's just.
It's people thanking you both.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. No. Okay. It's always a little confusing. So I want to thank you, Akwugo, for your amazing lecture, for answering all of these questions. You too, Heleen, for your response. And yeah, I hope that we can one day get together in person to do something like this again. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you guys so much for everything.
Thanks to the audience for their great questions.
Take care, you guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.